National Shrine of St. Rita. So, please feel free to, if you're looking for an Augustinian hat, T-shirt, or other just Augustinian spirituality resources, please visit the shop at the on the website for the National Shrine of St. Rita. If you're in the Philly area, please visit the shrine and stop by the shop. And if you don't see what you're looking for, give them a call because they may have it. So that's first thing. Second, for those who are not already subscribed to the daily Augustinian reflections, St. Augustine reflections, really encourage you to do that. You can go to the scroll down to the bottom of our homepage and sign up and get a morning reflection with normally a quote from one of Augustine's sermons, and then a reflection on it that was prepared by one of our friars, and I start my day with that after reading the Divine Office, and would encourage that for anybody else. Third, we're going to complement this series led by Kevin on Augustinian spirituality with another series just on the fundamentals of Catholic faith formation. So we'll kick that off in the fall. And so stay tuned for word on that, and spread all this to your friends, please, who are interested in growing in their faith. And with that, then I think probably this is time for a quick prayer, and then I will turn the podium over to Kevin, who will lead us through the discussion this evening. So, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear God, we thank you for this opportunity to come together as an Augustinian Catholic community and grow in our faith and our understanding of you and our understanding of each other. And we're very grateful to all those who have put this together this evening. And we pray in a special way to St. Augustine. Please intercede and pray for our friars. Saint Monica, please intercede and pray for our children. And Saint Rita, please intercede and pray for all of those special concerns that we have, for which we are asking for a greater understanding of the will of you, our God. Amen. In the name of the Father and the Son and Holy Spirit. Thank you, everybody. And Kevin, I will go on mute and turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, Jim, thanks again. As always, happy to see everybody back. So here we are, which now puts us officially in the backstretch of the series, because this is the 7th of 12 sessions that we will have together covering the confessions. As you remember, we did the introduction, and then that leaves us with 13 books to squeeze into 12 months. And so the point of saying that is that today we had the rather challenging task of doubling up and tackling both book 7 and 8 in a sitting. So this is going to be a little bit more compact, but I did find in working through this and listening and putting together the notes that being required to make it more compact, I really felt actually brought out into sharper relief what's going on in book 7 and books 8. So you can be the judge of whether you feel it lands that way for you as well. So the way we'll do this is pretty much according to the format that we've had, except that this is going to be kind of 2 sessions in one. So I'll introduce book 7, say a little bit about how it's structured, hit the highlights, and then move on to book 8 and do the same thing. So without further ado, why don't we jump into book 7? I think it's fair to say from the outset, the first time reading book 7, many people find this rather challenging. Would you, by nodding or show of hands or anything on Zoom you care to do? Yeah, okay, thumbs are up. Yeah, this is not an easy read the first time through, and there are reasons for that that we're going to explain, and I think make book 7 a lot more sensible. So let's do this. Let's talk about how book 7 is structured, and then we'll work through it. Well, book 7 divides, if you're looking at terms of word count, almost exactly in half. It's a very neatly formatted book, which is interesting to observe that really, I didn't put this in a spreadsheet or anything, but each of the books of the Confessions tends to have a rather unique structure. I think this is part of the artistry of Augustine. He doesn't tend to repeat himself. I mean, even structurally, each of these books have variatio. There's some variation. There's some way that he modifies how he presents the material. We'll see this in book 7. We'll see it in book 8. Hopefully that's become clear in the prior 6 books as we've talked about the structure. But book 7 is at least neat in this respect, in that it does divide into almost 2 exact halves. The first half of book 7, Augustine is explaining his metaphysical structures. Okay, we have to unpack that first of all, because the truth of the matter is most of us don't have metaphysical structures. We think about the reasons that people stand outside the Catholic Church. When folks, generally speaking, show up, these are not the problems that they have. Having a materialistic view of God is probably not what the ordinary priest hears from the ordinary convert or the person who's coming from evangelicalism or Protestantism. I mean, we all know the typical things that people, sub their toes on. They're predictable and they're obvious, which is, of course, infallibility of the Pope and Mary and the saints, and we can go on relics, we can go on down the list. These are not Augustine's problems. So we got to get in tune with what his problem is. That's the first half of book 7. He's explaining the problems. They are metaphysical. We'll talk about what that means. Basically, though, he has a very materialistic notion of God. We'll see why in a second. He's very concerned about the problem of evil. I think more people could tend to sympathize with this. I mean, the problem of evil, both in the world and the problem of evil that we experience personally, internally, this is something most people relate to rather easily. The problem of evil, of course, stands at the starting point of almost every religion or philosophy. This is something that we have to deal with. It is a metaphysical problem. So that's part 1. Part 2, Augustine's going to talk about the books of the Platonists. Most people that come to the Confessions don't have any idea what he's talking about or who these people are, and that's completely normal. Because if you had an intro to philosophy class, ever, whether it's in high school or college, you might have talked about Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. I can guarantee you did not talk about Plotinus. So this is just not a name that comes up, but this is a name that everybody in Augustine's circle is talking about. So we'll touch on this. So part 1 of book 7, Augustine's problems. This is not his ethical problem, it's his intellectual problem. And then part 2 is the books of the Platonists. What are these? How do they help? We'll unpack this. So part 1, let's start with a quote from Augustine. Augustine says at the beginning of book 7, he says, by now, he basically leads off this way, by now my evil and wicked youth was dead. I was becoming a grown man. Okay, so let's screen share. You know how I feel about pictures. All right, so you've seen this before. The stages of life that ancient people thought in terms of that Augustine passed through. It's not a bad idea to just reflect on this for a brief second and note where we are. We remember Augustine talking about his infancy in book 1, boyhood, and the school years in book 2, the young adult around 16, the pear tree incident in book 3, and then here we are. Augustine is saying, I've passed out of adolescence, the way that an ancient person would think about it. I've passed out of young adulthood, and now I've entered into manhood. And as we talked about before, in the biographical part of the Confessions, about half of the book deals with those first 3 stages, but about half of that first section of Confessions is all located in Milan. This is the city of Augustine's manhood. And this is where he begins really coming to terms with things in a mature way. So that helps us locate where we are in terms of the stages of life. But Augustine's problem is this. This is what he tells us. He says, I can't conceive of God as anything except some kind of body filling space. He has no care for spiritual substance. And that actually might, frankly, be true of a lot of us. I mean, when we try to think about God or visualize God, probably something comes to mind. There's some stuff that we see, unless our imagination is a little more refined and we have some sort of Trinitarian image or some such thing. There is a natural tendency to we can't really think in any way other than bodily, because we're embodied beings and we interact with other embodied beings. This is what Augustine's saying, and so he says it actually more succinctly this way. He says, although you are not in the shape of the human body, this has nothing to do with the incarnation. He's just talking about God, properly speaking, the Godhead. Although you're not in the shape of the human body, I nevertheless felt forced to imagine something physical occupying space, diffused either in the world or even through infinite space outside the world. Admittedly, I thought of this as incorruptible and inviolable and unchangeable, which I thought was better than anything corruptible, violable, or changeable. So Augustine's trying to help us see, I've got some of the attributes of God right. Okay, he's incorruptible, he's inviolable, he's unchangeable, but I can't help thinking about him bodily. But why is this? And why is Augustine so acutely aware of this? I don't think we're really acutely aware of this. We probably don't really think that hard about how we think about God or how we visualize God when we pray, but Augustine thought very, very hard about this. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The first will take us back very quickly to book 4. Part of this, you might remember Augustine read a book by Aristotle called The Categories. It's a philosophical text that deals with understanding the nature of being. Augustine said this in book 4 about Aristotle's categories. He said, what help was this book to me when it really turned out to be an obstacle, thinking that absolutely everything that exists is comprehended under these 10 categories? I tried to conceive of you also, my God, wonderfully simple and immutable, as if you too were a subject of which magnitude and beauty are attributes. So what Augustine, I think, is trying to say here is that this book, Aristotle's Categories, actually reinforced the notion that he already had about God. He could think about God as somehow material. And importantly here, he's thinking about God as a collection of attributes, which is a theological mistake that he points out. God is not a collection of his attributes. My son actually went to a Catholic high school before we were Catholic and got a pretty good dose of Thomism while he was there. And at some point later in his life, he was having a conversation with a youth pastor in an evangelical church and somehow stumbled into this. And he made the remark to the youth pastor. He said, well, you know, when we say God is love, we're not saying that God possesses attributes. First, God is equal with his attributes. I mean, they are one and the same because God isn't a compound of attributes. God is love, pure and simple. And this guy was just like, he's like, I'm going to have to think about that, but I'm not sure that you're right. And my son Ashton was like, I'm pretty sure I'm right. You know, God is, he is love. He's not merely a collection of attributes. In any event, this is kind of in the same vein of what Augustine's talking about. So Aristotle's Categories as a philosophical text did not help him solve his inability to think about God spiritually. Because the sort of thing that Augustine's going to say is, in another place, one of his sermons, if you want to think about God in a certain sense, try to visualize righteousness. I mean, we can play this game here for a second. Try to visualize righteousness. Like, okay, maybe a righteous person would, like, don't picture a saint, visualize righteousness. Well, I can't. Why? Well, because it's invisible and I only understand it when I see it in action. This is the sort of things Augustine is saying. Yet now you're getting closer to visualizing. I try to visualize righteousness. Okay, this is more in tune with where Augustine thinks we should be in our thinking. So we do have Aristotle's text, but there's something much more fundamental going on. And this is that while he's reading Aristotle, and during all those years that he's a professional teacher, of course, we know that Augustine was a Manichae, low level. He's an auditor. He's not high up. He didn't appear to be interested to pursue that. But Manichae dualism was sitting in the background of everything going on in his life. And dualism is another term that we need to unpack. And you might be surprised to learn that we don't have to do this by ourselves, because this actually enters into the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So Manichaeism is mentioned a few times. I was maybe as surprised as you are to find that it gets some airtime. It's in here. So I'm just going to read this rather quickly. This is from 285, right? Since the beginning of the Christian faith has been challenged by responses to the question of origins that differ from its own, ancient religions and cultures produced many myths concerning origins. Some philosophers said everything is God, that the world is God, or that the development of the world is the development of God. This is pantheism, not to be confused with panentheism that we've talked about before, although tangentially related. Others have said that the world is a necessary emanation arising from God and returning to him. Still others have affirmed the existence of, this is the important part, two eternal principles, good and evil, light and darkness, locked in permanent conflict, parenthetically, dualism and Manichaeism. According to some of these conceptions, this would be true Manichaeism, the world, at least the physical world, is evil. It's the product of a fall. It's to be rejected or left behind. So we have the Catechism here to help us to unpack dualism. What is dualism? Well, it's one of the explanations that's provided in certain philosophies and religions that says basically good and evil, kind of the yin yang. That's not a terrible image. It's good and evil that are just kind of always embroiled in this conflict, and it's not obvious necessarily who is ever winning. So let's say something about this Manichaeism origin story or myth, because we can't really make sense of book 7 without this. If we don't know the Manichae story, then what Augustine is on about is going to be extremely difficult to make sense of. So Manichaeism, I posted this a long time ago. I think a few people might have read this, but I'm going to give you the really, really quick thumbnail version of how Manichaeism said the world began, because this is what Augustine's coming from. This is what he's wrestling with. Manichaeism starts with the most basic question of all religions and philosophies, which is, why does evil exist? Where does it come from? And this, of course, is part of the appeal of Manichaeism for Augustine. Manichaeism's answer comes from this radical dualism. It's not yin-yang, that's an Eastern concept, which is actually a bit more balanced. But it is this idea that at the beginning of the world unfolded in a couple of phases. Okay, well, most everybody has some sort of phased approach to the world coming into existence. That's not necessarily wrong. Okay, but here's what's necessarily wrong. In the first of these phases in Manichaeism, you have these two co-eternal principles that exist that are totally separate from each other. So you have the good, which is what is nice and agreeable and intelligent and peaceful, and it lives in the realm of light, okay? And then the principle that's over this is God, or they called him the Father of Greatness. But then you've got this other principle that's intrinsically evil and malignant and disagreeable, and it's generally associated with matter. And sometimes the Manichaeans would associate this with Satan. This principle of darkness inhabits its own realm, its own place, which is darkness. So you've got light, you've got darkness. They extend in 3 directions infinitely, but on the 4th front, there's some sort of interface. I'm just explaining to you what Manichaeism teaches and where Augustine's coming from on this. But a picture would help, right? So let's have a quick look. Okay. This is darn near perfect. This is probably, I mean, I searched and searched for images of Manichae dualism, and yeah, not the funnest search I've done, but this image is actually like spot on. This is the sort of thing to visualize. This is what Manichaeism is saying happens in the beginning. You've got this realm of light, this realm of darkness. They have this border that interfaces. Okay, so then here's the next phase in Manichaeism. So what happens is there's this turmoil which endlessly takes place inside the realm of darkness, and evil starts to get kind of boiled up, and it comes up to and invades this border and crosses over into the light realm. Okay, so evil invades into the light realm, and as a defense, this good principle, the Father of Greatness or the Mother of Life, creates the primal human. This is our little individual standing there. And this primal human is given the responsibility of defending the realm of light. This is what Manichaeism says happens at the beginning of the world. Well, it doesn't go well. The primal human tries to hold the line. After a long battle, the evil principle overcomes the primal human and captures his light and takes that light and turns it into matter and then creates the material world out of it. Okay, so this is all rather bizarre. I hope you're sticking with me on this. We're going somewhere, right? So this is what's in the background for Augustine. That image, this story of light and darkness, of the primal human failing, the darkness being able to come in and pull out some of the light of who God is and go and take that and create matter and create the universe. So that this is actually less sophisticated than Eastern religions of yin and yang that are in constant conflict with one another, because what you have now is contamination. This is the basic Manichaean idea. You have contamination because some part of God has been extracted. It's now embedded in matter, and this is the problem that has to be fixed. This is where Augustine is coming from. The reason that I explain all of that is to try to help you understand where Augustine is coming from when he says, I can't picture God as anything except material. Well, this is why. This is where his head's at. This is what he's been soaking in. The problem with this position is that it's self-refuting. And the point is, early on in Book 7, one of Augustine's friends in this Milan circle, Nebridius, points this out to everybody else and says, look, guys, like, let's stop and think about this for a second. He said, basically, what we're being told that we need to believe is that you've got God who is this good principle, but he can be threatened, and that actually he can ultimately be diminished, and that he's diminished because the evil came in and took the light, and then whenever you find the light somewhere in the material world, you're actually seeing God. And so what you end up with is really that you've got good and evil that aren't actually absolutely opposed to one another, but good and evil actually have something in common and have this kind of odd mutual attraction, so that evil is not really entirely evil and good is not really entirely good. Well, this is what Nebridius points out to everybody, and Augustine reports this at the beginning of Book 7. And this is actually what Nebridius says. This is the quote from Confessions. Augustine says, this is what Nebridius used to say, and he said we were gobsmacked when he said this, because it was like, oh, right, this couldn't work. The Manichees postulate a race of darkness in opposition to you. Augustine addressing God, right? Okay, we all understand this now. What could that have done to you if you had refused to fight against it? If they were to reply that you would have suffered injury, that would make you open to violation and destruction. Okay, what has Augustine said? Even though I can picture God in a body, I know that he's incorruptible. I know that he can't be diminished, but Manichaeism is insisting that God can be violated and damaged and diminished. But if nothing could harm you, that removes any ground for combat. And so it's a very subtle thing. Nebridius is presented to us as repeatedly by Augustine as one of his friends who has a quite subtle mind. And he makes this point to Augustine, and this becomes a terrific part of the answer for Augustine of realizing, okay, the Manichae answer to this doesn't work. So he's dislodged. Okay, right? But something else has to show up in order to put him on the track to be able to think about God correctly. And that's where the books of the Platonists are going to come in. And if you've caught these couple pieces, you basically get the gist of Book 7. Nebridius's argument knocks him off of his chair. He says, okay, I've got to interact with something that's going to allow me to see God in spiritual terms. The books of the Neoplatonists show up, and this is what does it for him. We'll see in a little bit of just a little bit of detail in just a second how this works. But before we do, we've got to tackle the next metaphysical problem that Augustine had, and this is the problem of evil. Because remember what we saw in the Catechism and what we've seen from what we've talked about so far. I mean, about every religion and philosophy is committed to trying to answer the question of, you know, where does evil come from? What is evil? So Augustine moves on in this first half of Book 7 and says, okay, I've abandoned these ridiculous Manichaean origin myths. However, this makes the residual problem of the origin of evil that much more acute for me. Like, now this is the problem I really feel deeply, and that's paining me. And so the next part of Book 7 is going to be him working out the problem of evil, which he doesn't do entirely, but he gets a good distance on this. So Augustine says a few things at this point. He said, I had no clear and explicit grasp of the cause of evil. So, okay, this is unambiguous. Once he begins being released from the Manichae dualism, he realizes, like, I don't have an answer anymore. I had an answer, but it's a terrible answer, so now I need a better answer. Augustine goes further and says, I directed my mind to understand what I was being told. Well, told by who? Probably by Ambrose. Namely, that the free choice of the will is the reason why we do wrong and suffer your just judgment. This should not be lost on us, that one of the distinctives of Milan is that Augustine has come underneath the preaching of Ambrose. And there are points where when Augustine has a problem, and we've seen this since the beginning of Book 1, where there's a theological or philosophical problem, it actually takes divine revelation to get him to where he needs to be. Because what he sneaks in here is, I've still got problem if I don't understand the issue of evil, but as I'm listening to Ambrose, I'm beginning to learn through divine revelation that this is ultimately a function of the human will. That evil is one part of the answer to the problem of evil is that it is a function of defects in the human will. So Augustine in this section is going to trace out three things about the problem of evil, all of which don't get him where he needs to be. So he drops this little hint. Ambrose is kind of seeded the answer for me. But then he goes back and talks about everything we just talked about, a Manichaean dualism, and says, okay, that doesn't work. So that's got to go. And then there's another section that follows immediately on that where he uses this analogy of the sponge in the ocean. Okay, that's not a Manichaean idea. That's actually a notion from Greek philosophy. But he says, but that doesn't quite get me where I need to be either. And then it's confusing to people at times. Why does then Augustine talk about astrology? Okay, we're tracking along, metaphysical problem, the problem of visualizing God, and then the problem of evil not being solved by Manichaean dualism, not being solved by certain parts of Greek philosophy. But why astrology? And the answer to why astrology is because astrology is another failed attempt to explain the problem of evil. That's why that's here. If you're reading along, you don't have that in mind, and you come to the section on astrology, which is rather protracted and honestly I find kind of tiresome. It's a really long story with Firminus. But he's making the point is that this is another failed attempt at understanding the problem of evil, and it's one that I have to set aside. And with that, we're going to set aside Augustine's metaphysical problems that he's explained to us, hopefully with a little bit better understanding of the Manichaean theory in the backdrop that he is wrestling with, and also recognizing that what Augustine is doing is he's walking us through the answer work. And then at the midpoint of, almost the exact midpoint of book 7, we are introduced to the books of the Platonists. So we're going to spend maybe 5 or 10 minutes on this, and then we'll move on to book 8, and then leave ample time for questions and make an effort not to run all the way up to the hour. So midpoint of book 7, he pivots, and he says, they were put into my hands by this outrageously arrogant or proud individual, which scholars have lots of fun trying to figure out who this is. Nobody knows, or nobody knows for sure, but somebody gives him the books of the Platonists. Okay, first thing we got to unpack with this. When we hear the books of the Platonists, everybody sees the root in that and says, oh, okay, Plato. Yeah, but we're not talking about Plato. So if you're thinking like Euthyphro or the Trial of Socrates or the Republic, these are not the books of the Platonists that are in view here. So let me show you what he is reading. Oop. Okay, this is what Augustine's reading. Well, obviously not this one. And in fact, the tricky part of this for scholars is that what Augustine is reading, he disliked Greek, or at least he presents himself as intensely disliking Greek, at least as a child. And the Aeneids of Plotinus were written in Greek. Augustine did not read this in Greek. We learned this at the beginning of book 8. He was reading the Aeneids, not to be confused with Virgil's Aeneid. He was reading these in the Latin translation by Victorinus, who we're going to meet in just a minute. So when Augustine is talking about what he is interacting with, this is the picture that you should have. Like, don't think about Plato or Socrates, Aristotle. That's not where we're way, way, way down the line in the development of Greek philosophy. So Greek philosophy, in a certain sense, begins with Plato, but 600 years later, that trip basically ends with Plotinus. Plotinus is the final development. It's the last flowering of Greek philosophy. This is the end of the road. There's no further development in Greek philosophy after Plotinus, and this is what Augustine has in his hands. So he's got the Aeneids in his hands. This just comes from the Greek Aeneia, which means 9. And so this is 6 groups of 9 very interesting but very dense treatises that were written by Plotinus and organized by his disciple Porphyry. And those are 2 names that Augustine's going to repeat throughout his other works, but particularly when you get to the City of God, Porphyry is talked about constantly. So this is what he's reading. Okay. So in these Platonist books, Augustine says he discovers something that nobody that is a modern that's reading this, unless they've got a background in philosophy, is going to expect to hear. What he says is I discovered, and he qualifies this not exactly in the same words as he says, the same teaching that's found in the prologue to the Gospel of St. John. This is the great attraction of the Aeneids. This is the great attraction of the Platonist books, is there is an enormous amount of overlap in what Plotinus's understanding of Platonism was teaching. I mean, in Plotinus's understanding of Platonism, we'll just call it Neoplatonism. That's not what they would have called it because that term wouldn't make sense to them. It makes sense to us because we have to label it. But they basically conceived of God as a Trinity. So the notion of God as Trinity is not, okay, you have to tread very carefully here. Their notion of the Trinity is radically different from the Catholic notion of the Trinity, but the idea that God is triune is not the exclusive property of the Catholic Church or Orthodox Christians. Having said that, these are two groups of people that understood that they were not saying the same thing. So when Plotinus says God exists as a Trinity, he is imagining God in a way that it would not really be in conformity with the Nicene Creed or anything like that. And this becomes obvious to us because Augustine points this out. He says, well, goes through and basically rehearses most of the first chapter of John, which is the introduction of the prelude to the Gospel of John. And he says, I basically found everything there except for one thing. Did anybody catch what the one thing is? The one key thing. Well, the one key thing is the incarnation. He said, I saw all of this there, but that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, I did not see in the books of the Neoplatonists. And this is the radical point of departure. So you've got people using the same language, envisioning God in terms that are mutually understandable. But here's the breakdown for the Platonists. There is no possibility that any part of their Trinity would ever be fused with matter. This voids the whole idea of Plotinus. This cannot happen. So the incarnation for the Platonist or the Neoplatonist is an absolute impossibility. So we come to an impasse. It should be obvious even from what I said, but there's absolutely no dependence on the Catholic Church's development of Trinitarian theology on Neoplatonism. These two interacted with each other while understanding that they were different. But it is remarkable, and it was remarkable to a group of well-trained intellectual Catholics in Milan that the books of the Neoplatonists were rather serviceable. And there was quite a bit in there that was useful, and Simplicianus, in fact, is going to validate this when Augustine meets him in just a moment. So Augustine says this in summary, but that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, I did not read there. And he could not read there because Plotinus would have never been able to imagine that. In fact, Porphyry makes a comment about Plotinus. He wrote a little biography about Plotinus when he put the Enneads together after his death. And he said the thing about Plotinus, who was a deeply religious and deeply sensitive man, for sure, but Porphyry says it was almost as though he was ashamed to be in the body. That's a very remarkable comment. It's almost as though he was ashamed to be in the body. That this is the essence of Neoplatonism. We want to escape matter, not in the wildly unsophisticated way that the Manichees are describing it. I mean, Neoplatonism is an order of magnitude of sophistication and frankly, truthfulness beyond what the Manichees had. But it's still kind of coming out of this dualism of, I need to escape matter. It's just Neoplatonism has a much more sophisticated, much more palatable way of doing it. But Augustine's going to say that, okay, that's not going to get me there. That's not going to get me to where I need to land. So the Enneads, having said all that, do have an effect on Augustine. And what they do and what he testifies that they do is they drove him back into himself. This is the language that he uses. And so we can almost see kind of the birth of Augustinian introspection or the interior life. Really, we can pinpoint this and say, well, this aspect of Augustinian spirituality, like, I know where this comes from. This is book 7 of the Confessions. Augustine says this for the first time in his life after reading the Enneads. It drove him back into himself, and he realized the possibility of self-knowledge. He realized that his mind has the ability to reflect on itself. Remember, every description Augustine's given up to this point, it's always the soul is going outward to find the answer, right? It's going out into the created world to try to find the answer. what Augustine is saying is that via the encounter of the Aeneas, I realized I could go back inside myself. This is a rather dramatic and significant development, really, for like all of Western philosophy and spirituality and our own kind of sense of self. So Augustine has this experience that his own mind can reflect on being a mind and the process of thinking and memory, which we're going to get into. But the immediate result of this revelation that comes from reading the books of Plotinus is that he begins really thinking about going into himself and thinking about the nature of what is good. And he says three things that really demonstrate that he's coming to terms with the problem of evil, and the Platonist books are the thing that helps him do this. Because right on the heels of reading this, he says three things. One, it was obvious to me that things which are liable to corruption are good. I'm gonna think, okay, we gotta think for a second here. Wait, what did he just say? If something is liable to corruption, it is good, right? It has to be, because that's the nature of corruption. Corruption is that there was a good that was there that's not there anymore. So if something's liable to corruption, it is good. Okay, so let's try to lodge that, and just believe it if you can't reason it out yet. Just accept that what Augustine is saying is true. If something can be corrupted, it is good. Then he goes on to say, the evil into whose origins I was acquiring is not a substance, for if it were a substance, it would be good. This is, yeah, it's straining the brain, but he's going to land us somewhere that's extremely important. Evil is not a substance. This is what he gets from. Now, there are places in Plotinus where I think Plotinus does say evil is a substance, but in what Augustine is reading, he lands on evil is not a substance, it's not a thing. Okay, well, this Manichaeism is complete nonsense then. What he arrives at is the definition of evil that actually we all still basically work out of, which is evil is not something, evil is a privation. This is like the great Augustinian accomplishment at this point in his life. Don't think about evil as a substance. It's not a substance. Evil is the good that should be there but isn't there. That's what a privation is. I've been deprived of something, right? I was deprived of my child. What does that mean? That means I had the horrible experience of losing my child. That I was deprived of this comfort. We all know what deprivation is, but we don't make this connection with the problem of evil. But Augustine makes the connection in a way that's changed how everybody in, frankly, Western civilization thinks about evil, which is those who are thinking about the problem, which is that it's a privation. The good that's supposed to be there is not there. Something has been corrupted. That is the nature of evil. It's not a thing to itself. It's only a corruption of a good thing. This goes pretty far in helping get to the other side of the problem of evil, insofar as one can get there at all. Okay. I'm going to skip over something. Augustine has this rather remarkable experience in the midst of all of this. Let me just suffice it to say at 717, he's taking in Plotinus. He's realizing his own interiority and the capacity that gives him. He's starting to make real progress on the problem of evil. And then he says he has this philosophical-ish, mystical experience. Like, you can't even imagine the amount of literature, the ink that has been spilled by scholars on this. So he says this. I'll just read it and move on. 717, Augustine says, in the heels of all this, so in the flash of a trembling glance, my soul attained to that which is. Okay. At that moment, I saw your, and he quotes from Romans here, invisible nature understood through the things which are made, but I did not possess the strength to keep my vision fixed. My weakness reasserted itself, and I returned to my customary condition. What exactly is this? We have no hope of answering this in the next 20 minutes or probably the next 20 years. People have been debating what is going on here. I'm not even going to get into the possibilities. We'll do this another time. A vast literature, something mystical happened. He had some mystical experience inspired by Plotinus, and most of the scholarship that works on this acknowledges this was some sort of legitimate mystical experience. We'll leave it at that. All of this, though, should suggest something to us, which is that there was, in fact, a certain level of sympathy between the Neoplatonist and the Catholic intellectual in the 4th century. And this sentiment was aptly expressed by Simplicianus, who we're going to meet just around the corner. Augustine reports something in the City of God. Definitely want the visual while we do this. This was as close as I could get to what I really wanted, but you'll get the idea when I give you the quote. So in the City of God, Book 10, Augustine reports there what we're about to read in Confessions at the beginning of Book 8. He says this, he says, I was often told by Simplicianus, that saintly old man who later became Bishop of Milan, that there was a certain Platonist he knew who used to say that these words, the prologue to John's Gospel, should be inscribed in letters of gold and displayed in the most prominent place in every church. And so this is the quintessential statement for understanding how close these two came to one another, Neoplatonism and an intelligent, well-read, well-trained Catholic mind in the 4th century. Let me read it again. I was often told by Simplicianus, that saintly old man who later became Bishop of Milan, a certain Platonist used to say that these words, the prologue of John's Gospel, should be inscribed in letters of gold and displayed in the most prominent place in every church. And with that introduction, let's go ahead and transition over to Book 8 and meet Simplicianus, and then work through in the next few minutes what happens in Book 8. So Book 8, if you had the opportunity to read through this, is just filled with convergent stories. Book 7, we kind of, okay, we got into the sync of the rhythm of what Augustine's doing, right? And then in Book 8, okay, he scraps that, and then a whole new model, a whole new paradigm for how to tell the story. It is all rather artfully delivered, and for all of the moving parts to this, which we'll just have time to identify, there is at least a threefold arrangement that we can point to that's pretty straightforward. So part 1 of Book 8 is the meeting with Simplicianus. And what does Simplicianus do? He tells the conversion story of Victorinus. We move on from that. There's a clear break, and then Ponticianus, someone they knew from back in North Africa, shows up, and he relates a story. And it's the conversion of St. Anthony in the desert and some other people of real interest. And then there's a clear break. Well, there's actually a rather ambiguous break we'll talk about for a second. And then in part 3, Augustine relates his own dramatic conversion in an incredibly artful, but admittedly at some points kind of confusing way. And I think we can cut through the confusion rather easily. So by this point, the beginning of Book 8, Augustine has resolved these metaphysical problems, which I'm sure we're all thankful for, because that was probably about the biggest dose of that we're capable of digesting, or maybe exceeded. But he's at least saying, all right, I understand from the Platonist books, I've made some progress in the problem of evil. I can understand a spiritual substance, and I don't visualize God materially. At the end of Book 7, he has a really immersive experience with reading the letters of St. Paul. And this is all what's going on. This is where we find Augustine now. Of course, the mystical experience, but we're setting that aside for a moment. Augustine is now he's on his way, right? Like the intellectual problems have fallen off, the moral problem remains, right? He's looking around and he's paying attention to how Catholics live. And he says what a lot of people say today, which is, I could use some spiritual direction. Like I could use a spiritual director. People say exactly the same. I've literally heard someone say that in the last 24 hours. People still say this. I need a spiritual director. And the person that he goes to is Simplicianus. He's an old man at this point, even in the story. But in 10 years, he's going to succeed Ambrose as the Bishop of Milan, which, quick anecdote, sometimes in the reading, I just run across stuff. I had no idea where this was coming from, but it's too good to not pass on. Apparently when Ambrose was, it's not funny, he's dying, but apparently when Ambrose was on his deathbed, he selected Simplicianus and dryly remarked, he's old, but he's good. That's what he said. You can, I don't even know what else to say, but that's what Ambrose said. That's what St. Ambrose said when he appointed Simplicianus. So Simplicianus takes over the churches of Milan. He's old, but he's good. So um, the conversation that Augustine has is, should I be married? Should I be single? I don't know what to do with myself. And the first thing he says is, look, I've been reading Plotinus translated by Victorinus. And then Simplicianus says, oh, that's a funny thing. I knew Victorinus back in Rome. And so there's something that happens here that is, from a literary standpoint, is rather remarkable and has been written about and deserves to be written about, which is Augustine keeps using this technique of embedded narrative, which is a character in the story tells a story, right? So there's like, it becomes layered. It's really rather sophisticated and it's very effective. So embedded narrative, Simplicianus, who's a character in the Confessions, now starts telling a story which we're supposed to pay attention to. And so what Simplicianus does is he tells the conversion story of Victorinus. If you read this, then you picked up that the parallels between Victorinus and Augustine are fairly obvious, right? Victorinus is highly rhetorically skilled. He's a Neoplatonist. I mean, he's the guy who translated the Platonist books from Greek to Latin that Augustine's reading. There's a delay involved in his conversion. He abandons the teaching post. Like, it's almost too good to be true, right? And Augustine even says, I realized that Simplicianus told this story because he knew it would register for me. I mean, Augustine basically says this. I understand why he chose the story. So he tells the story. Great. Tells the story. Augustine's fired up a little bit. Says, this is the example to follow. I mean, if it was good enough for Victorinus, I mean, this guy was my superior in this world. I should do what he did. But he can't do what he did. This is the problem. Augustine says, I want to, but I don't have the strength because I've developed a sexual habit with the woman that I live with, and I'm not giving it up. It's just the intellectual problems have fallen off. The moral problem has not. And I can't fix the moral problem myself. This is what Augustine's saying. So then we jump forward to 8:6, and Ponticianus, a guy that they knew from North Africa, shows up, which, speaking of surprises, uh-oh. 1 second, sorry. I lost my visual. I think we all need a little breather anyway. Here we are. Okay. So this is rather fascinating painting of,
Kevin, we're just looking at your collection here.
uh-oh.
Yeah, it's a surprise of a different sort.
Oh no. Wait. Success.
There we go.
Aye, aye, aye. Okay. I had no idea this painting existed, and I've spent a lot of time looking for Augustinian art. I've never seen this one. So this is the story of the meeting that we're talking about right now. So Pontigia shows up. It's a gaming table. This is rather cleverly depicted. The letters of St. Paul are sitting there. He sees this. Here's Alypius. Here's Augustine, Vindicatus, and he realizes, oh, you're reading St. Paul. That's quite interesting. I have a story to tell you. So we get our second embedded narrative, which is Ponticianus taking his cue from the Apostle Paul, this becomes a theme we should be picking up on as well. As the Apostle Paul is like omnipresent here through the end of the conversion scenes. Sees this, and then we head into another embedded narrative, which is Ponticianus starts telling the story of a point in time in the past where he's some sort of government agent. There's a group of them that are in Trier with the emperor, and they've got the afternoon off, and they're walking around. They split up in pairs. You read the story, right? And then Pontificanus tells the story of his colleagues wandering off and finding this like little monastic community, which is probably too strong of a word. It was basically a hut with some monks living in it. And they encounter the life of St. Anthony, which is also, interestingly, a Greek text that had just been translated into Latin within a generation. And so they encounter the life of Antony, and these two government officials have this massive conversion experience on reading the life of Antony. Interesting sidebar on this, one of the probably most important French scholars in Augustinian scholarship in the 20th century made a very interesting argument that this government agent who experienced the conversion while reading St. Anthony was actually Jerome. A lot of other scholars don't go along with it, but it's so compelling and so interesting that it's like one of those you want to believe, like, please be right, please be right. But the story is, Courcelle is the French scholar's name, and he thought this was actually the backstory of Jerome. This is Jerome's conversion story, but that we're not told that explicitly. So we'll just take that for being true in the moment because it's too interesting to not be true. But in any event, this is the second embedded narrative where a conversion story is related, and Augustine hears this. And then this is where book 8 lands. So it's rather, there's a bit of comedy to this because Augustine basically says Pontificanus was just like, he's just talking on and on and on, and I zoned out. This is not what it says in the Latin, but it's basically what he says. He's like, he's just talking and talking, and I zoned out. And Augustine, while Pontificanus is telling the story, the final struggle is set in motion. Like, this is it. He's heard about St. Anthony in the desert. He's heard about him coming into the church by happenstance. The gospel's read to sell everything you have and give it to the poor. And he does it because that's the St. Anthony conversion story. So this is what Augustine's hearing. And it sets him where, like, the conversation's going on, but he's in another world now. Like, he's gone inside. And a lot of what happens in book 8 from here on out is Pontificanus is talking and Augustine's in his own head. And you've got like 2 or 3 chapters where Augustine is just talking about what's going on in his own head while Pontificanus is continuing to talk about St. Anthony. So this is going on. Finally, Pontificanus leaves. Augustine's like beside himself. He runs outside, tries to find a place to gather himself, and starts actually like reverting back to a state of infancy. I mean, he's describing himself as having like these spastic, nonverbal responses to the strain of what's going on interiorly, and Alypius is just kind of there watching. And then finally, Augustine takes flight from, like, he can't even be with Alypius anymore. And he finds a fig tree, throws himself under the fig tree, and the wrestling continues. One of the things that's rather important to point out before we jump to the last 2 points, the fig tree, the tolla lege, and St. Paul, is that Augustine does something here that I've never really seen any scholarship on. I think there's maybe a gap here, because he does something remarkable. While he's describing this inner turmoil, I don't know if you noticed, but he introduces these allegorical characters. Did you catch this? Like, there's this kind of wild shift where he's telling the story. He's talking about Manichaean, psychology and the problem of the will. And then all of a sudden, these 2 characters show up: Lady Continence with all of her kids, right? And then Vanity. So Lady Continence, capital L, capital C, and then Vanity, capital V, which is basically the figure for, in Augustine's struggle, sexual suggestion. I mean, he's very subtle about this and he's very tasteful, but it's obvious what's going on. And he's describing this conflict between these 2 characters, which is rather remarkable, that he personifies chastity, he personifies continence, and he personifies lust, and he has these 2 kind of in his head talking to him. Okay, that's interesting in and of itself, but that's not where I'm going with this. What's super interesting about this is there's a contemporary of Augustine's named Prudentius, who was a legitimate Christian Latin poet, who wrote this allegory called the Psychomachia, the battle of the soul, the battle of the mind. And the whole thing is an allegory where every vice and every virtue is personified, and they have a fight. Now, nobody's ever tried to argue that I've found that Augustine ever read Prudentius' Psychomachia, so maybe this is just something in the air. But it is rather remarkable that contemporary with Augustine, you have an entire Christian poem dedicated to an allegory of the virtues and the vices that, in theory, Augustine could have seen. And then when he talks about the critical moment in his conversion, he drops into this psychomachia allegory. I mean, I'm not stretching this. This is exactly what happens. They're personified, they're fighting, and he has to make decisions. I'm not sure why no one's picked up on that. I do find it rather interesting. If you want to read, so the tangent here is if you want to read a rather interesting piece of Latin poetry that works this idea out like to the nth degree, you can pick up a really good translation of the Psychomachia, and you might find that rather enjoyable. So here's the ending. This battle takes place. Augustine throws himself under the fig tree, and he can't get himself to the finish line. And what happens? We talked about this last time. In each of the conversion stories, there's a voice that comes from the outside that says something that has a totally disproportionate effect by a person who did not intend for it to happen that way. Remember this with Alypius, right? With the circus. It's going to happen again with Monica in the next book. But here's what happens. It's a child's voice. You read this. I mean, this is the most important part of the whole book, ostensibly. I don't know what to do with myself. I'm hysterical. I'm alone. I'm battling these visions, these allegorical women in my mind, trying to embrace one, trying to reject the other. While this is going on, I hear a child's voice. I don't know if it's a boy or a girl. And they're doing this sing-song thing. It sounds like they're playing a game, but it's no game I ever played as a kid. And the child is singing, tola lege, tola lege, tola lege, tola lege, tola lege. And he's like, that's not a kid's song. Where's this coming from? Well, tola lege, tole, pick up, lege, read. Pick up and read, pick up and read, pick up and read. He hears the child singing this over and over. And what does it? This is the voice of God to him, I think importantly through the voice of a child that tells him to pick up and read. And what does he do? Gets up, runs, grabs that. Remember what was sitting on the gaming table? The Letters of St. Paul? Yeah, it's the same book. He goes and grabs that, opens it up, points to a verse, and says, I got to know what to do. And if you read the book, at the end of book 8, you see what he does, what he reads. The light goes on, his conversion is effectuated. This is Augustine's description of how his conversion ultimately comes to his conclusion. But it's obviously a very, very long process. But it's a child's voice singing a song that he never heard that drives him back to a text on the gaming table where Vindicianus had just been telling the story. And this is the moment of full conversion. Goes to Alypius. Alypius says, I don't want to be left out. So he reads down a little bit further and he says something to the effect of, don't reject the one of little faith. And Alypius says, well, I guess that's me. So I'm in. So now both of them have read Paul together and decided to embrace fallen Christ and be united to the Catholic Church. And they immediately go and tell Monica. And so this is where the story ends. And this is where we'll end for tonight. It's 8. I failed wretchedly at getting us to the finish line a few minutes early. That didn't work out, but I think we've got one question in the chat, and if anyone else has others, happy to take those. So Nico says, curious that the author noted the certainty of Antony of the desert, but didn't tell us more about him. What was it about Antony that struck so many converts? If there's time, could you discuss the monism of Neoplatonists? This is what I looked into reading my chapter, reminding the Kantian distinction of the noumenal and the phenomenal. Let's 801, so I can take the first half of this for sure, but I would be very interested to pick up the conversation with about Neoplatonism and monism after offline. What was it about Antony that struck so many converts? Well, I think in Antony's, so there's a quick two-part answer. So what struck Augustine in context was the drama of the instantaneousness of Antony's reaction. This is the thing, because Victorinus had been an example he could relate to of delay, but Augustine's already delayed. But when the St. Anthony story is told, this is spontaneity, this is instantaneity, where he hears it and he just walks out of the door of the church and does it. And that's what Augustine needed to hear at that moment. He needed to be pushed over the edge by seeing the example of someone who just had an instant response to the gospel and went out and just spent the rest of their life in response to it. So I think that's why it had that effect on Augustine, but why Antony had that effect on so many others, I mean, in terms of basically fathering the whole monastic movement and filling the desert with monks, um, charism, the drama of his example, the unfathomable holiness of his life, spiritual warfare. I mean, I think all of these things factor in why in his own lifetime people were quite interested, combined with the cultural reality that the Roman world at the end of the fourth century was a place that a lot of people were tired of. Not entirely unlike our own. A lot of people just feel like, man, it feels like this trip's kind of run its course, and I just like I don't want to be a part of this. I want to be off the grid in some way. And Antony does provide an opportunity for people to go off the grid in a way where they're still living an authentic Christian life, and the appeal of that at that particular point in time, that particular point in history, was astonishing. So I do apologize. We ran a few minutes over, but hopefully that's helpful, and I will turn it over to Jim to bid us farewell.
Yeah, Kevin, this was awesome. So first of all, I just want to thank you for uh, of all of these are great, but I particularly found this one really super great. For lack of more eloquent language, Augustine would be unpleased with me right now, I think. But so I just want to thank you, and for everyone who joined. I want to thank you guys as well, and yeah, just share my thoughts in 30 seconds or less, which is this is what it means to be a lay Augustinian, is to dive deep into our faith and deep into our Augustinian spirituality, and you get out of the headlines and get into the details, and really, just as Augustine did, think first and embrace second. And I'm just so grateful for Kevin, for all the work you did to prepare this and to lead it, and for all of you for joining. And I pray to God for all of you tonight, and I wish you all a wonderful evening. And God bless. Good night. And Kevin, thank you again.